that, everyone. Good evening, and thank you all so much for joining this Duchenne UK webinar as part of our series since coronavirus hit. Today, we're very pleased to be joined by Emma Heslop, our DMD Hub Manager, and Dr. Michela Guglieri from the John Walton Muscular Dystrophy Research Centre in Newcastle. The topic of today's webinar is the DMD Hub and an update on clinical trials and how we get them back up and running after the impacts of coronavirus. And thank you all for joining us on this lovely evening. I'm going to kick off with about coronavirus, and do feel free to ask questions using the toolbar in the Zoom toolbar, and we will come to questions at the end of the short presentation. So as I'm sure you're all aware, coronavirus is having a huge impact on medical research, and medical research charities are estimating a £310 million shortfall in their research spend over the next year. And this is devastating, really, because medical research charities do really play a huge role in this ecosystem of medical research, funding research, funding clinical trials, and funding the staff, the scientists, the doctors and nurses to deliver those trials. So we, as members of the Association of Medical Research Charities, are asking the government for financial support for the charity sector to make sure that vital research that we fund doesn't stop. I'm pleased to say that Duchenne UK remains in a robust position in spite of all of this, thanks to our incredible supporters. And our commitment to DMD Hub continues apace. And we're really pleased to share the news that we did in a press release a few days ago that we have appointed 7 new posts to the DMD Hub in recent months. And the work of the Hub has continued through coronavirus and will continue with plans we have for gene therapy that Emma Heslop will be updating you all on. So just a very, very quick, brief introduction to the DMD Hub. So the idea for it came in 2014 when Alex and I, and working with the team at Newcastle, realised that there was a chronic lack of clinical trial capacity for Duchenne. And despite there being a wealth of knowledge and experience of these trials in the UK, trials were being turned away at what was a very exciting time for the research pipeline, because there just simply weren't enough doctors, nurses and trial coordinators to bring those trials here. And this was really devastating for families in the UK who perceived trials happening elsewhere but were unable to access them here. And I remember Alex and I Newcastle to do a big meeting about this, and one family said it was like being on the Titanic. You could see the lifeboats in the distance in the form of clinical trials and the hope that that offered, but without being able to get your child onto that trial. So we felt this was a very serious situation and wanted to do something about it. So in 2014, the landscape looked pretty much like this. There were 2 centres of excellence, Newcastle and Great Ormond Street, but they were running at capacity. And there were other sites seen here in yellow that were running trials, but really were at the limits of what they could do in terms of offering more trials. So the DMD Hub was born. Duchenne UK has invested 2.7 million in the Hub to date, and this is what the picture looks like today. The UK is no longer turning away clinical trials. We are open, very much open for business. So now, instead of the 2 centres of excellence, we have them, but we also have 9 other clinical trials. And the DMD Hub really is operating the central coordinator, helping companies to find clinical trial sites that will have capacity for their trials. There are now 16 clinical trials and natural history studies in the UK. The DMD Hub has funded 32 posts. 5 studies are now in setup, and there are more than 250 boys now on interventional trials as a result of the work of the DMD Hub. So our next big ambition is to tackle gene therapy and look at how we can bring gene therapy trials to the UK. So I'm very pleased now to hand over to Emma Heslop, the DMD Hub Manager, who is going to update you all on the work that we've been doing so far and the work we will be doing to achieve this ambition. Emma.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us to hear a little bit more about the DMD Hub. As Emily has described, we are very happy with the progress that we've made with the DMD Hub, successfully accomplishing our initial aim to expand clinical trial capacity and really establish this network of clinical trial sites ready and able to run trials. Our new challenge for the new phase of the DMD Hub is all around gene therapy. And on this slide, I've tried to illustrate that, you know, we have lots of options coming up. There's going to be at least 2, possibly 4 gene therapy trials expected to arrive in the UK in the near future. There's considerable interest, of course, excitement and anticipation around gene therapy, and it's important that the DMD field is prepared for this. Much of the expectation is justified, and it's based on the promising preclinical data that we've seen, maybe in some of the other neuromuscular conditions such as SMA. But it's also important for us as the DMD Hub to take an objective view and think about the realistic possibilities and possible limitations of gene therapy for Duchenne. And when we're considering these likely barriers, we should plan how we're going to run these gene therapy clinical trials and work collaboratively together. So on the next slide, I've illustrated that to address this as a community, if we better understand what is possible, what is not, and what the hurdles are that we need to overcome, we can effectively prepare. We can put in place initiatives and take steps to overcome the barriers. We can anticipate the issues and tackle them in advance. So as the DMD Hub, with this in mind, we planned a one-day meeting with over 100 stakeholders in attendance to think about how best to prepare for AAV vector gene therapy. The stakeholders who attended the meeting represented leading UK neuromuscular centres, patient advocacy groups, national and local pharmacy representatives, colleagues from NIHR, industry representatives who had experience of running gene therapy trials in neuromuscular diseases, and industry representatives who were currently setting up gene therapy trials in DMD. We invited the regulators, so NICE and NHS England were there, as well as government-funded organisations that are working to facilitate gene therapy. The main focus of the meeting was to discuss the challenges and barriers of running gene therapy trials and to think about how we can successfully get gene therapy products approved and reimbursed. We are preparing a meeting report which will be published in a peer-reviewed journal, but Eleanor kindly prepared and very quickly prepared a list summary that was sent out to the public, and I think that you should have hopefully received that via the DMD Hub newsletter if you're on that list. On the next slide, we talk about the results of the meeting. So it was a very informative and well-attended meeting, and what came of it was key priority areas that we identified, and as the DMD Hub were working on or have plans to start working on in these tasks in the near future. So the first area is around developing gene therapy resources. To help prepare the field for the upcoming gene therapy trials. And what we've developed so far is already available on the DMD Hub Toolkit, which is on the DMD Hub website. And some examples of things that we've been working on include a lessons learned document, and we've had involvement from sites that have run SMA gene therapy trials in the past, so mainly Newcastle and Great Ormond Street at the moment, but we've also got documents on there to help signpost to existing relevant initiatives, because there are already existing initiatives that are doing a lot of work around gene therapy, and we don't want to duplicate any effort. The second area just around publication, which I've already mentioned, we are working on that and it will be available in the lay meeting report. And the third area is around an institutional readiness survey. So just to explain this a little bit more, we conducted a survey in preparation for the meeting last November, which the results of it were very informative, and it indicated that there were 3 DMD Hub sites that had potential relevant experience in running AAV gene therapy trials in a paediatric population. Some of the other sites had some of the experience, but not all of the requirements that they would need to be able to run gene therapy trials and meet the criteria required by industry. Therefore, an outcome of the meeting was that we agreed to redo the institutional readiness survey, but working more closely with industry and with government organisations to better understand the requirements for the sites for running these trials, and that work's now underway. The second area that we will work on continue to work very closely with the trial sites. So we want to better understand the requirements for running gene therapy trials, see what the sites can or can't already deliver. because it's often a case that you don't know what you don't know until somebody tells you that you don't know it. And where possible and appropriate, we want to aim to offer the support to the sites that they need. And this might be in the form of liaising with industry on behalf of the sites, or it might be around providing specific training for staff at those sites. It's most likely that more than 3 sites will be required to take the number of gene therapy trials that are planned to come to the UK. So we're considering how we could potentially deliver this in the UK, and we're thinking about a hub and spoke model where there would be a number of sites who would be selected, accredited, should we say, by industry as gene therapy delivery sites, and other sites that might be available as satellite follow-up sites to help spread the workload a little bit as well. Communication between the Genetic Monitoring Safety Committee and the Ethics Board was highlighted as a potential bottleneck during the meeting. So we felt like the DMD Hub had a role to play in facilitating and coordinating these discussions between the groups on a national level, and to promote the idea of potentially a central ethics committee for reviewing gene therapy trials and ensuring that the genetic modification safety committees communicate with each other if they're reviewing an application for the same trial before they make their final recommendations, just to make sure that the 2 committees don't come up with conflicting suggestions or outcomes. And then the idea of to ensure that recruitment to these trials, because there's very limited spaces, is fair and equitable. We're working on implementing a central recruitment procedure for DMD Hub sites, and we've received excellent feedback from sites, and it's likely that we will be piloting this central coordination activity in the very near future. 2 other areas where we are working on the next slide is that we will be continuing our active patient engagement. Obviously, this is very important to us and to Duchenne UK. And one big area of work is around a patient preference survey. So some of you might be aware of a patient preference survey that PPMD conducted in 2017, and the results of that have been published in a number of articles. But what we felt as a result, again, of the meeting is that things have changed a lot in the last couple of years. We now have results from trials, and we're a lot more informed about gene therapy. And with it coming to the UK, we thought it was an ideal time to redo this survey. So we were planning to work with PPMD to redo the survey in the UK, and then they will also do it in the US. So this is something that, again, that we're working on being rolled out later this year. We're also working hard to keep the community informed via the DMD Hub and the Duchenne UK mailing lists, and we will continue to do this as and when we receive relevant information. And then educational events, which Duchenne UK often put on to make sure, again, that the community is informed, is something that is one of our priorities. The last area, just to reiterate, is that collaboration is very important to us, and it's very important to the Duchenne community. So we're working on new collaborations as well as maintaining the established collaborations. So we're continuing to work with the NIHR around costing templates, with all of the NHS trusts involved, with the DMD Hub sites, with the genetic modification safety committees, with new government funded organisations such as Catapult, with a focus on gene therapy, and the NAATTC, which is the Northern Alliance for the Advanced Treatment Therapy Centres. And any other stakeholders that are of relevance and importance to the work that we're doing. So I hope I've tried to demonstrate that there's a lot going on. We're already doing a lot, but there's a lot of work planned as well. And this is just specifically around gene therapy for the DMD Hub. We are involved in other work, which I will now pass over to Michela, who's going to give a little bit of an overview of some of the other important initiatives that we're involved with.
Thank you, Emma. I just wanted to give a little bit of an update of the work that has been done from a clinical perspective in response of the COVID-19. and how we try to coordinate as much as possible the response to the pandemic for clinical trial on a national level. Probably the first starting point has been that as you know, COVID-19 has reached us a little bit as a surprise for all of us, and therefore the initial response in terms of clinical and clinical trial activity has prioritized the need to be quick and to try to pass the communication with the parents as quickly as possible. And at that point, it was very difficult to coordinate a response site to site because physically we did not have the time to assess each single study and each single circumstances. At the same time, I think that we've tried our best with the DMD Hub to maintain an open communication with the families in order to try to keep everybody informed about the decision study by study through the clinical trial finder. Next slide. But at one point we are aware that this has created some confusion or disappointments from family because they have different approaches in different sites in terms of the response. So what we now have been working on is whether we could be more coordinated and harmonized in trying to restart clinical trial activities. Most of the clinical trial activities were put on hold in response of COVID-19 back in March this year. Although I have to say that a great effort was put from all sides to try to keep study open when possible, either through home dosing or safety home visit by nurses, and to conduct a remote visit. In some cases, study visits were put on hold, a study drug discontinued temporarily to ensure safety of the patient. Over the last few weeks, however, it became quite clear that we needed to try to find a solution in order to allow study sites to reopen clinical trial activities. And this is also because we need to consider that the situation with COVID-19 is unlikely to disappear one day with another, and therefore we now need to develop some model that will allow us to continue clinical trial and research activity in a safe manner. So we have been having two conference calls with all the hub sites that are currently participating in clinical trial in Duchenne muscular dystrophy and try to harmonize our response. Please keep in mind that as much as we try to define some guidelines and some common and reach some consensus, there are factors that are not under our control. So we all agree that it's our intention for all the hub sites to start a clinical trial activity as soon as possible. However, the decision remains still in the hands of the site and on the study. And this is because sometimes the trust at each single site has a specific condition or specific requirement which allow or does not allow us to restart clinical trial activity. In addition, as you know, some of the staff were redeployed in some centers, and some centers were more affected by redeployment than others. And what has always been and will always be our priorities is to be able to provide clinical research in a safe manner. And therefore, some clinical trial activity could not be recommenced until we were sure to have staff in place to monitor safety and efficacy of the patient. In general, the agreement at the moment from all the hub sites is that a clinical trial can be started independently from the clinical follow-up. And this is because quite often clinical trial activity and the clinics are run in different departments or in different contexts. And this often allows clinical trial activity to be more controlled by the clinical research staff compared to a clinics which has to follow the trust policies. We also agreed that when we think about restarting clinical trial, the priority has to be given to studies that were ongoing at the time of at the start of COVID-19. And these will have the priority compared to new studies. We thought that it is ethical and is fair to give access to drug to boys and patients that have been receiving the study drug for a while, and they were unable to in response of COVID-19. This is a priority, does not mean that we are not intended to start new studies, but is a prioritization. Some study, as you might know, can offer the ability to administer study drug when an infusion is required by a home nurse at home, or other study where the medication might need to be taken orally. The sponsor might offer the possibility for nurses to visit the boy at home for safety monitoring, which include, for example, check the heart rate, the blood pressure, or blood test, or test of the urine. Whenever possible, we thought that this is a safer option because avoid families to travel and to attend hospital appointment. However, these really need to take into account specific circumstances and family preferences, and therefore sites were agreed to be open on different options. We also have reached an agreement for each study about the priority in terms of safety and efficacy assessment. We all agreed that safety is mandatory and is the priority when arranging a study visit. And in terms of efficacy, we will always try to prioritize and to collect the primary endpoint to ensure that the study remain meaningful and that the data that we collect will still help the sponsor to reach a conclusion about the efficacy or non-efficacy of a treatment. Secondary endpoint will be prioritized in order to guarantee what we routinely do in clinic. For example, if the North Star is not the primary endpoint of a study, we tend to do it because it will help us to make also clinical decision. Other secondary endpoint will be performed as possible. At the end of the day, however, we need to be honest and say that there is always a risk associated with attending hospital or travel. And we put every effort in order to minimize the risk. And each hospital has made a decision to reopen clinical and clinical trial activity based on the fact that we can ensure that all the personnel can wear PPE and the environment is kept as safe as possible. But at the end of the day, is the decision of the family, what is their preference and what is their feeling. And this is something that we cannot remove, and therefore the communication between the clinical trial team and the family is essential. Next slide. So we also, as you know, probably most of the, all trusts have put actually screening on hold in response of the COVID-19 pandemic. And therefore, for a while, we have not been able to screen a new patient in open ongoing studies. So we have now, some of the trusts now are allowing us now to restart screening. And we have agreed that the priorities will be given to patient best interest. We will try to screen a patient first for the trials that are going to close to recruitment sooner, or to patients who are likely to lose the ability to be eligible for a particular study in the near future. And the third priority is for study for which there is no other treatment option available. Next slide. Now, actually, these are already questions. The last question that I want to actually point out is that I mentioned before that we agree to prioritize open studies versus setting up a new study. At the same time, all sites are already working on setting up a new study, although we are not able to reopen to recruitment. and are working hard with the ethics committee and trust regulator and authorities in order to have this study assessed as quickly as possible, in order to be able to open this study as soon as is considered safe.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michela, and thank you, Emma, for your presentations. They were excellent, and I think, you know, the whole community really does, you know, thank you for continuing to drive things forward during this difficult time. So we had some questions that were pre-submitted. The first one is, will gene therapy clinical trials be able to start due to the immunosuppression element? I don't know if Michela, you could maybe answer that question.
Yeah, I'm happy to try to answer this question. I think that we need to consider, first of all, the reality that we do not have any gene therapy study currently open to recruitment in the UK. So the hold is not really for the immunosuppression element, but is because we do not have an open study at the moment. I'm quite pleased to say that things are moving forward, and we are proceeding with the idea to be able to open, hopefully, gene therapy study in the UK in the near future. At that time, probably consideration regarding the immunosuppression element will need to be made. But obviously, as you know, in this situation, it's very difficult to predict what will happen in 2 weeks, and even worse, what will happen in 3 months' time. And therefore will be a consideration that we'll need to re-update. Surely we will need to put in place things in the consideration that for a certain period of time, patient will be immunosuppressed on a higher level compared to their current immunosuppression related to the chronic treatment with corticosteroid. But I would not assume that the immunosuppression required for gene therapy will exclude the participation in gene therapy trial because of the COVID-19.
Okay, that's great. And then another question is, can we have an update on the Antisense oligonucleotide trials?
So different aspects. So when we talk about Antisense oligonucleotide trials, there are ongoing trial in the UK that has been ongoing for a while, mainly led by the Sarepta. These, again, depending on the site, they were put on hold in terms of infusion, or infusion have been able to continue through the COVID-19 pandemic to home dosing. The good feedback is that in general, there is no intention to discontinue these studies because of an interruption in dosing, and the discussion with the sponsor has always been very supportive, with the aim to continue to offer access to the drug to the boys that have been recruited so far, and hopefully to restart recruitment as soon as possible. And actually, we have a new patient recruited in antisense oligonucleotide recently.
Oh, that's great news. We've got another question. So are we using any learnings from other gene therapy trials, as they can be complicated, especially other neuromuscular diseases and even with eye conditions? Emma, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about the different speakers we had at the meeting and how you're working with the different companies?
Yeah, absolutely, that's fine. So yeah, correct, it is very complicated, and that was one of the really reasons why we thought it was so important to hold this meeting with all of the key stakeholders. And as part of that meeting, we did invite industry to come who had experience in running gene therapy trials in neuromuscular conditions. So we had a really excellent speaker from Avexis come, and he was very open and transparent about some of the issues that they had faced. We've made sure that we included those comments and thoughts in the publication that we've been preparing as well. And we're quite beneficial in the neuromuscular community that the sites, Newcastle and Great Ormond Street, are the two sites that had been running these trials and did have the experience from AAV for gene therapy trials. So some of the staff that are working in the DMD Hub as well have been able to help us prepare these lessons learned documents, which I referred to which is available on the DMD Hub toolkit as well. So we definitely don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to understand what worked, what didn't work, what we have to do to make sure that gene therapy comes for Duchenne as quickly and as effectively as possible. So yes, we are, a long-winded way of saying we definitely are learning from other conditions.
Brilliant. We've got another question. I think this probably will be more from Michela. Can the hubs put in place assessments for high risks of ADHD, ASD and OCD in boys living with DMD? Can we have better administration of Ritalin across the hubs?
Yeah, this is it's definitely something that I probably has been, I don't like to use the word deny because it was not an intention in that, but for a long time probably is an aspect that has not been on the priority list. We have over the last few years, however, we have really, I think, in general, moved into other assessment of other associated complications with Duchenne, specifically focusing on the complication in terms of brain and cognitive. So although I do not have anything in place or to suggest at the moment, I think that is definitely something that we should explore more as a next step in Duchenne.
I think definitely, and I know Francesco has received funding for a big grant looking at the brain and is planning lots of different studies which should be interesting. Another question, seeing the criteria for patient prioritization for new trials is great to see. Where will this data be drawn from? The DMD registry or from the neuromuscular teams at Great Ormond Street or Newcastle, etc.?
I'm happy to start, and probably anybody else, or do you want to start?
I'm happy for you, whichever, Michela. Would probably say the same.
Exactly. So this is another initiative that we have been working and supported by the Hub regarding the criteria in assessing patient for clinical trial, with conscious of the fact that gene therapy might raise further concerns from families. The general approach is that we really want to be as open as possible and ensure that everybody is given the possibility to take part in clinical trial, including gene therapy studies across the country. And it's not only the geographical distribution or attending a clinical trial sites that will give access to clinical trial. So we are currently working on developing some SOP, so some standardized approach to define how patient will be, let's say, selected or chosen or picked for participation in clinical trial. And these will take into consideration that all sites will be able to recruit both patients that attend the specific clinical trial site, but also patients that come from other areas. And we are trying to see how can this be better coordinated. The DMD registry, I think that will be the best option, although we'll need to do some work on the DMD registry as it stands at the moment in order to fit for purpose and be able to deliver this tool. And therefore we are working with the Hub in order to try to have a centralized process in place. So we are working on it. Is again nothing that is has been delivered, and is still a work in progress. So we still need to define how to better coordinate this. We always need to consider that there are eligibility criteria that will need to be followed. And there is the need for a site that participation in a trial to have as many information as possible regarding a family and the boy in order to be able to do a pre-assessment to confirm a patient eligibility as much as possible remotely.
Yeah, and I think too, we've just had another question in. I'm going to read it out, but I do think you've answered the question, Michela, but I don't know if Emma wants to add anything. So here's the question. If my son is eligible for a gene therapy trial, we've told our clinician, but I'm worried we will not be contacted. How are boys selected, etc.? Also, will sites consider patients that live further away, as we would be prepared to travel?
Yeah.
I don't know if you've got anything to add, Emma.
Yeah, so it would be just adding on to the discussion that Michela, or the comment that Michela has just had, that it's part of what we see as a quite obvious next step for the DMD Hub. So within the DMD Hub, we've created the clinical trial finder, which tells patients about trials, where the trials are being run, and how they could potentially kind of flag up their interest in being involved in those trials. And this central coordination or recruitment SOP that Michela was just discussing there is around, you know, not only knowing, for patients to know where the trials are being run, but to actually think about how patients could flag their interest in being part of a clinical trial, whether that be gene therapy or any other clinical trial. And we are in the process of working out how that will work and discussing it with sites as well across the DMD Hub, and how it will be implemented on a national level. But for example, some of the questions that we might ask would be around, you know, what kind of trial would you be interested in taking part in? Would you be prepared to travel? At the end of the day, it's always going to be up to the clinicians at the individual sites to say yes or no to patients being enrolled into a clinical trial. But what the Hub is trying to do is to facilitate the access to these trials. One of the key elements of the SOP that we're developing is that it could be that sites agree that a number of places might be available for local patients, but a number of places might be available for out of area patients as well, just to ensure that balance. So it's not only the patients that are seen at that particular site that are then recruited to clinical trials in that site. But it is a very, you know, it's quite a complicated structure that we're trying to pull together, and we want to make sure that it is as fair and equitable as it possibly can be. So we are considering at the moment how we can run a pilot of that over the next year.
Fantastic. And Emily, I believe you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, I did. Thanks so much for all of your insights so far, Emma and Michela. I mean, Emma, you talked in your presentation about managing expectations, and I think it's, you know, we need to be clear that there are going to be more patients wanting to take part in gene therapy trials than there are going to be available slots. And I think, you know, that's the nature of clinical trials, and it's going to be really hard. And, you know, we will, through the DMD Hub, try and make it as fair as possible. But given, Michela, I just wanted to ask you, given the small number of boys who have taken part in gene therapy trials already in the US, is it possible to say now how many boys you think will be taken onto a gene therapy trial in the UK, or is it too soon to say yet?
I think that is too soon to say yet, and we are in the phase of setting up, and therefore I don't have this information from each site. And it will also depend about the timelines of different, as you know, it's not one gene therapy study that is considering to come into the UK. So it's possible that we will have participation in different studies, and hopefully with at least a slightly different inclusion-exclusion criteria to give access to a larger or a differentiated population. So I wouldn't feel comfortable now to talk about a specific number. There are different factors that can influence this answer. But I would also like to emphasize what you said, and I fully agree that we need to be open and honest. And I know that there is a great interest in gene therapy. I always have to emphasize that it's still a clinical trial, that it's possible that we'll have a placebo-controlled study, and there will be inclusion-exclusion criteria, which will make some of the boys not eligible to take part. And I have some concern with this regard to the fact that people might feel that if they are not included in gene therapy because there is no available places in a site, or because they do not fit inclusion criteria, they have missed the boat, and this is the boat that everybody is waiting for. I think that we need to be realistic and say that it's still something that we are investigating, as we have learned so far from other clinical trials, is an evolving field, and this gene therapy study will inform us about gene therapy in Duchenne and might lead to different approaches, and therefore is not the one opportunity that will be missed.
Okay, thank you, Michela. I don't think we've received any more questions. So if Emily can move to the last slide, I want to say a huge thank you to Emma and Michela for joining us on this beautiful evening. And I found the webinar really informative. And I think, you know, I don't think Emily and I or Michela could have thought that, you know, when we met for the Newcastle meeting back in 2015, that the hub would have grown into what it has today and given so many patients living with Duchenne the opportunity to take part in clinical trials. So, you know, we're very grateful to everybody for helping us make this happen. And, you know, especially to Michela and the other clinicians and stakeholders who've dialed into this call. You know, it really is positive, and it gives us as families so much hope. So if you need any more information about the DMD Hub, you can visit the website. And thank you everybody, and have a lovely evening. Thank you.